I'd then like to elaborate on why we should welcome change with optimism and with courage. But let's take a step back for a moment and actually address the definition of change. What is change? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, change is to, quote, replace something with something else. Now, in light of this definition, I'd then like to present all of you a question. That question is, how much of your life has been influenced by change? Now, as you ponder on this question, you actually start to come to many discoveries. One of these discoveries being how change has had such a profound impact on the way we live today, whether we are conscious of it or not. An indisputable example of change would be the pandemic. Because we can all agree that the pandemic has changed the way we live today. And this isn't necessarily limited to the physical aspects, like social distancing, but our mental health as a collective has suffered a blow from the pandemic, arguably. And for the sake of highlighting the importance of welcoming change with optimism and courage, I then like to elaborate or employ the pandemic as an appropriate illustration of change. For example, according to the World Health Organization, they published a study detailing the effects of the pandemic upon the masses. And interestingly enough, what they found in the study was that the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a 25% increase in prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide. And it was also noted in the study how, quote, young people were most affected. Adolescents, well, in other words, us. So I'm sure many of you aren't exactly surprised by this news, because many of you suffered some form of increased stress as a result of the pandemic. And like me, I'm sure many of you interpreted this increase in these negative emotions as being directly imposed upon by the pandemic. Put simply, we all blame the pandemic for our stress. But I'd like to propose an idea. The pandemic never predetermined this outcome of increased stress and anxiety among the youth. Rather, we chose this outcome ourselves. Now, okay, this idea might seem controversial, but hear me out, because how many of us here, as a result of the pandemic, say lack in physical activity? How many of us here scroll through social media for hours and hours on end, disregarding our sleeping habits, our eating habits? See, I certainly am guilty of doing so, and I'm sure many of you are. It is to be expected in some sense. And the thing is, all these actions contribute to a suboptimal way of living. All these actions, well, deteriorate our mental health in a way. And so I'd argue that the ultimate cause of this increase in stress and anxiety among the youth can be traced back to refusing to welcome change, being fearful of the prospects of change that the pandemic presents upon us. Because in no way, by any stretch of the imagination, am I saying the pandemic was our fault. We cannot find a common ground in that the pandemic was completely beyond our control. And it is. We had zero control over it. However, it's imperative to understand that the actions we choose to carry out as a result of the pandemic ultimately fall on our accountability alone. We are accountable for choosing to live a lifestyle that compromises our mental health. Pandemic never puppeteered our actions, so to speak. And hence why I argue the pandemic never predetermined this outcome of increased stress and anxiety, but we chose it ourselves by adopting this poor lifestyle and deteriorating our own mental health. And what a lot of us don't realize is that, interestingly enough, the more responsibility we exert over our lives, regardless of external circumstances such as change, or in this particular instance, such as the pandemic, will we be able to attain a higher level of fulfillment from which we were previously unable to derive by denying responsibility, strengthening our mental fortitude. And basically what I'm saying is, when you welcome change with optimism and courage, you start to acknowledge that the pandemic was not our fault. You acknowledge its difficulties while also acknowledging your responsibilities as an individual. And so I'd like to stress that I'm not blaming any of you for this, because it would be quite hypocritical for me to criticize you for this when I have taken part. So again, I'm not blaming you for it, and it's also quite difficult to handle so much responsibility, especially when it's thrust upon us, and especially when the pandemic seems to sap away all our motivations. However, what a lot of us again forget is that difficulty does not imply impossibility in any sense of the word. It certainly is possible to deal with change and live in a life that doesn't compromise our mental health. It's only the attitude with which we need to approach change with.